Well, welcome to our first event in International Education Week. I'm Dr. Linda Palumbo. I'm the head of the International Programs Office here at Shore University, so welcome. This is what we call the Global Perspective Forum. This forum was created many years ago to provide a good place for us to have good discussions about matters that are relevant in the world today. So in this opportunity, we're going to discuss the immigration crisis, and in this forum, we hope to have a good, constructive interaction of ideas that makes us think about how we need to approach the subject as Christians. All right? So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panel. We have, I'm going to go by alphabetic order. Dr. Corey Barnes, he's the chair of Christian Studies Department. We have Dr. Charles Carter, he's the associate professor of history. Dr. Darville, he's the chair of the Department of Business Administration. And finally, Dr. Busan, he's associate professor of French. And the moderator is going to be Dr. Kathy Bosovich. She is the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and also associate provost. The way we're going to do this, each professor is going to have a 5 to 10 minute presentation on their views on immigration. Then Dr. Bosovich is going to lead a discussion on certain questions that we have done for them, and then we're going to open the floor for questions from the audience, okay? One thing is if you are, you cannot stay after the first part of the presentation, like Dr. Warner was telling me, if you can exit in a kindly manner, not to disrupt the conversation that we're going to have at that point. And also, if you are so kind, those of you who will stay until the end, to fill out a survey that we need for assessment. If you complete the survey, you get a chance to win a gift card from Starbucks. So, that's a good deal, I think. All right, well, thank you. I'm going to let Dr. Carter.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming out to see us at this forum. This is a very, very important topic. The title of my short talk is Causes of the Refugee Crisis on the Southern U.S. Border and Possible Christian Responses. As the title suggests, we're going to be looking at the reasons why there is a refugee crisis on the southern border and what we can do about it as Christians. Before I begin, though, I wanted to pose two questions to you in the audience. One is a general question, and the other is a more specific question. And these two questions have a lot to do with why we have the refugee crisis. The first question is, do any of you know what region of the world has the highest homicide rate? And the more specific question is, can you tell me the country over the past 10 years that has traditionally been at the top when it comes to homicide? Do any of you know the region of the world? Sometimes we think it may be the Middle East because of the issue of terrorism and things like that, but what part of the world has the highest homicide rates? Interestingly, it's Central America. This is the homicide rate of various countries, and you can see 3 of the top 4 are Central American countries. Honduras, typically over the last decade, Honduras, El Salvador, Colombia have competed with one another for the unenviable position of the highest murder rate in the world, and it's often Honduras that wins that. And what is the reason for this? Well, I think the reason becomes clear when we look at this map. All of these blue dots here in Central America represent some major cocaine seizure that happened over the last couple of years. It turns out that drug trafficking, particularly cocaine, which begins in Colombia and makes its way to the United States, Central America is very vital in this narco trafficking. And as a result of narco trafficking, there's been immense amounts of regional instability in Central America. And the civil unrest has led to massive influx of refugees coming to the United States in hope of a better life. They can't go south, of course, they can't go to Colombia or Venezuela because those places are troublesome. They don't want to stay in Mexico because of the cartels there, and also Mexico has a notorious reputation for mistreating immigrants from Central America, and so the only real viable option for refugees is to come to the United States. Indeed, many of these Central American countries have been referred to as narco states. Perhaps that's a pejorative term, but it's a term that has been used nonetheless. And what countries in Central America, some characteristics they have are extremely high homicide rate, widespread civil unrest, the general absence of law and order, the ubiquitous presence of gangs and drug cartels, few real job opportunities for social mobility. These are all the conditions really from which these refugees are seeking to flee. And so the big question for us as Christians is, what do we do about it? How do Christians respond to this refugee crisis on the southern border? And there's various issues and challenges that have to be taken into consideration when we look at this question. First, as Christians, we have to ask ourselves, how do we show Christian empathy and love for vulnerable refugees? You know, Jesus tells us in the Bible that we to love our neighbors. How are we to do that? Are we to rely mainly on Christian missionary work, humanitarian aid? Should the government be involved? These are legitimate questions that we have to ask. There have been, I'll tell you this, there have been missionary involvement in Central America for the past 30 years. It's one of the main regions of U.S. Protestant missionary work. We've won over a lot of people to Christ, but it's also a region that's still plagued by narco-trafficking, some of these issues that I'm talking about. And so that's a question that has to be addressed. Another question that has to be addressed is how to minimize creating a new class of victims. And what I mean by that is the issue of jobs. In the United States, we have tens of millions of low-class workers, low-skilled workers. And if you allow mass immigration, mass refugees to come into the country, would there be competition for jobs? Would this create problems for low-skilled workers in the United States? Would you be essentially creating a new class of victims, domestic victims? How do you address that issue? What about the issue of crime? This is something that's perhaps overblown. There's been various studies that suggest that as Central American immigrants have come into the United States, there have been increases in crime, like MS-13, these other Central American gangs. But it depends on who's doing the study. Some certain conservative Republican Party policy papers tend to say crime does increase in these situations where some of these immigrants relocate. Other studies have noted that crime doesn't increase, right? And so it depends on what think tank is putting out the policy paper, and so that's an issue that we're unclear about. And then there's a final point that we have to look at is what do these vulnerable refugees really need and want? There's been a couple opinion polls that suggest that most of these refugees would really prefer to stay in their own country, but what they would like to do is they would like there to be political stability in their country. They realize that in the era of Donald Trump that there will be lots of people who hate them and despise them in America. They would rather stay in their own country, but they have to leave because of necessity. And so the question is, what can we do to help improve conditions in their own country? Now let me provide a suggestion from history on how we might address this refugee problem. And I want to look at Woodrow Wilson and what he did in the early 1900s. Woodrow Wilson was a political scientist. He was our only U.S. president to have a PhD. In the early 1900s, the 19-teens, he was the president. And when he came to power, Central America was in big trouble. You had lots of regional warlords at the time, sometimes referred to as caudillos, who were engaged in all sorts of things like bank robbery, cattle thievery, the robbing of trains and things like that. And along with political corruption of governments, he introduced a concept that came to be known as humanitarian diplomacy or missionary diplomacy or moral diplomacy. in which what he did is he encouraged American missionaries, American businesses to go down to Central American countries to help stabilize these countries. What was controversial about this was that Wilson employed the Marines quite heavily in these areas in Latin America. And so sometimes they've been referred to as the Banana Wars. There were periodic Marine interventions in Honduras from 1912 to 1925, periodic Marine interventions in the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, and Haiti. And so the question is, if we're going to improve the internal situation in these countries, how best to do it? Can missionaries and humanitarian aid organizations do it alone, or do it need to be reinforced by American power, military power? And one suggestion is that we ought to look at this as an alternative. Indeed, I think the central point that I'm trying to make here to wrap things up is that we can expect refugees from Central America to continue coming to the USA in mass until the conditions in their nations improve dramatically. The Christian then should be focused on promoting humanitarian political reform and the rule and law in these nations. Our focus, in other words, should be international in nature primarily rather than domestic. That's my position. Okay, that's all I have to say.
So I'm Dr. Darville, I teach accounting, and I'm chair of the Department of Business. Since Dr. Carter brought up a couple of different things, business being one, government being another, missionary emphases, whether that be through some political program or whatever, I'd like to kind of maybe piggyback off of some of that. And I got a couple of statements first. One, we need to remember that God is neither Republican nor Democrat. God is neither American nor Sudanese. God is God. And we as Christians, there are two camps into which we fall, saved or lost. And so the dichotomy that we have is mostly created by people we listen to. That we think that as a Christian, because this person says that he or she is a Christian and espouses some sort of Christian belief system, that's probably what God does. But then you have someone else over here who says kind of the same thing, but from a slightly different perspective. And one of the things that I try very hard in my classes to do, because we're concerned with numbers, that's kind of our deal, but what we fail to understand is that numbers are also people. In terms of sales, people who buy products, whether it be domestic or international or whatever, and that you can never separate people into camps. There is one group for us, and it's called a consumer. And so how do we navigate that? And I've always said, and I love political seasons because we are faced with, in this country primarily, either a Republican platform or a Democratic platform, and I think it was Ronald Reagan, I could be mistaken, but you cannot govern from the extremes. And so when you go all the way over here to this camp, you've excluded a vast majority. If you go to this camp, you've excluded a vast majority of this way. Hanging out somewhere in the middle, espousing a little bit of both, is good. Do we have a responsibility to our nation to protect it and provide for our own people? Absolutely. Absolutely. Do we also have a responsibility as a country to take care of even the less fortunate in our own country? Absolutely. But then what do you do about the less fortunate who come? I have discovered that if we're not going to go to the world in the various ways that we're supposed to, the world's going to come to us. And I've been at Shorter 34 years, or this is my 34th year. And I've taught people from South Africa, from Russia, from France, from Germany, from England, from Italy, from Switzerland, from Sweden, from Japan, from China, you name it. You know what? They're just students. And I don't look at them any differently, nor do I treat them any differently than anyone else. You know, I don't think I had you in class, but I did have your husband in class a couple of times. Yeah, and so, you know, my perspective is I want you to learn the material and whatever. And I always say in political environments, the Democratic side of things has a very good pulse on providing social responsibility programs, systems, whatever, to take care of whomever. And not so much on the Republican side sometimes. And so it's never an either-or situation. It is not pitching big business against social programs, nor is it social programs pitching against big business. It takes all of us, and the government does play a role. With all of that kind of as a caveat, business has a unique position in that we are able to get into other countries by doing business, not as missionaries, whether it be from a Christian sort of perspective or from some sort of an ideological perspective. We have an opportunity to go anywhere in the world and conduct business. The world has shrunk dramatically. And so we have many more opportunities. In fact, there's a huge movement and organization called Business as Missions, because many countries will not let missionaries in. But you can go in as a business person, either working for a business or having created your own business and putting forth a proposal. Working and contributing to that government and to that society, they're a little bit more lenient in terms of your religious views and conducting yourself in that manner in the course of doing the business, not going in as a missionary. And I think we're going to see more and more and more of that for a gazillion reasons, which I'm not even qualified to really talk about, okay? But what we find, or what I have found, is that foreign students who come here to play, used to be back in the heyday here, I guess, of some sort, tennis. We had tennis players from all over the world every single year. We used to accuse the tennis coach of blindfolding himself and putting a map of the world on the board, on the wall, and throwing a dart, and wherever it hit, that's where he went and recruited that year. It was a wonderful opportunity. The nice thing is, having made friends with those students, now that they are out of school and they're back, many of them in their home countries, we're still able to have communication. And they write and ask me, what would I do? What should I do? Whatever. And so, you know, I think as a business person, I get to come at things a little differently than some of these. And I don't want to steal any of your thunder, and I really don't even know what you're going to say. But I do, but we go to the same church, so I have an idea of something that might come out of his mouth. I do think one of the things we need to seriously take stock of within ourselves is that every single person on this planet is an image bearer of God. It doesn't matter what they look like. It doesn't matter what their views are. We have a responsibility as Christians to model Christ. Period. That's our job. We can do that in words, and we should. But we should also do it in behavior, just in how we conduct ourselves. And, I'm all the way back. Okay. And so then, in our behavior, but also in our business models. How do we conduct business? And I liked your point of creating yet another group within the country that has been marginalized in some way, shape, form, or fashion. We need to get rid of that kind of stuff. We've got enough marginalized groups here. Put yourself in the place of a person from Sudan. Why would you want to stay if you have a family and you're trying to find just a way to stay alive? You can eat out of the garbage can if you need to, but you've got to be alive in order to do that. Should we provide some sort of an avenue to be receptive to them? And the answer to that is yes. Your comment about workers, it's been documented for at least the last 15 to 20 years. There are plenty of jobs manual labor jobs. But lazy Americans won't get out there and do it. So those coming particularly from across the border, Mexico, South America, they have come in and they're willing to do the job. Fine. But when immigration laws change in some way, shape, form, or fashion, they're now prevented from doing that. I think it was about 10 years ago, maybe even sooner than that, the cost of the crops in California that were decimated sitting on the ground because they didn't have anybody to go harvest the crop was in the tens of millions of dollars. Because Americans who could just go get the job without any issue would not. And those who wanted to get the job could not. That is a problem. And that is something that we need to take care of. There's probably a whole lot more which will, I hope, come out between all four of us. But I really do think if there's one thing I want you to really take to heart, is that every single one of us on this planet is an image bearer of God. And we have a responsibility to demonstrate that every minute of our lives to whomever we manage to come across.
I've asked for permission to go next because I want to piggyback on a couple of things that you said here. But first, cliche, well, I am actually an immigrant. And we all are immigrants, right? And I want to talk about what it's like, as Dr. Dario said, to be that immigrant. Now, of course, I came from Europe. So it's not nearly as harsh as it could be, as it is from coming from other countries. So for me, it was relatively easy, and I think I was actually ready to go to a different place. So it was great for me. But I want to tell you about the experiences of some immigrants. I was fortunate enough to read a lot for a course in the field, in the topic, and I've discovered a lot of very interesting things. Actually allowed me to know a young lady who was from El Salvador, who was in a nursing program, who told me what it was like living in El Salvador, and that basically her whole family and herself would probably be dead if they'd stayed. And all I need to think is about that. People who come to America, well, it was different for me, I came for fun, but a lot of people who come to this country come simply because they don't want to die. And I think we need to think about that very deeply. You were talking about the California food crisis, and that reminded me of 1942, when the Japanese were put in internment camps, Japanese Americans. What happened to the crops in California? They were all devastated. They were the only ones who had to grow strawberries and all these good things. So it's one of the things that happened. And you know, I could talk about that for longer. You were talking about language too. It's interesting because we don't have an official language in America, which I think is a wonderful thing too. Teddy Roosevelt, talk about politicians and presidents, actually said when he was president that immigrants should learn English or go home, which is an interesting perspective as well. We don't really talk about that very much at this point. So I'm an immigrant. I'm also a Christian, and that's what matters to me. We've heard before that Republican, Democrat, it doesn't matter. I wish we had a Christian party as they do in Germany, because that's where I go every time. And that's a wonderful thing to be a Christian. I want to read a couple of things to you. This is a wonderful book. I have two like this actually. It's called Immigrant Voices. And as I was looking through it, there was actually one little chapter. I'm not going to read that, but it's called A Hyphenated American. And you think about that for a second. That means when you come to America, you're not an American. You're a Chinese American. You are what they call ABC, American-born Chinese back then. You are Spanish American or Mexican American. I don't know if we talk much about French Americans, but just imagine what it's like to live with that. You're not an American. You're something else first, right? And that's the title of the whole chapter. Another thing, I'm not reading this, I'm going to read from this one in a second. This is a book that was written by a Chinese person. And something as simple as this. This person came to America to get a PhD, I think it was in chemistry, and was ultimately successful. There's one paragraph that begins this way. As Ralph, who back then was not Ralph yet, but still, Yi Feng. So, having to drop your name. Sounds like nothing to most people, but it's everything you are. It's your name. and what happens then. And I'm going to talk to you about that in a second. But this is the life of a man, and again, I'm only reading a few, well, more than a few lines on this one. And I'm not going to pronounce his name correctly, but his name is Gilbert Tuhabonye. Anybody heard of him? Quite a story, from Burundi. Gilbert Tuhabonye was born in 1974. It's like when I read. In the southern province of Bururi in Burundi, into a relatively well-off family of Catholic Tutsi subsistence farmers, largely removed from the ethnic violence between the Tutsi and Hutu in other parts of the country. Tuhabonye began running competitively while attending Lycée Kibimba, becoming a national champion by the 11th grade and dreaming of an athletic scholarship to an American college. It's just a dream. That's kind of nice. On October 21st, 1993, units of Tutsi-dominated army overthrew and executed President Melchior Ndadaye, who was Hutu, and key cabinet members. As news of the president's death spread, enraged Hutu made all Tutsis the targets of ethnic cleansing, killing tens of thousands of civilians. When the violence broke out, Tuhabonye's high school was invaded. The students hacked to death or burned. Tuhabonye was the only survivor. After an agonizing recovery from his burns, Tuhabonye returned to competitive running at Burundi University, where his success brought an invitation to attend the Olympic training camp held in La Grange, Georgia, prior to the 1996 Olympic Games. There's tons of stories like this in here. It's not necessarily everybody being killed in a high school. It's families being threatened to death because they will not carry drugs across borders. It is, I have these from Croatia, and there's stories from every country where tragedies have happened. So that's what I want us to think about. Again, coming from Europe, you don't come here to survive today, but there was a time we did, right? What is it like? Why do we think it's so easy for an immigrant to say, I'm just going to go to America, get a job, and have a great life? I would say, and Dr. Carter mentioned this before, he didn't talk about France, he didn't talk about Germany or Norway. Although at one point, people who fled Norway were going through the same thing. He's talking about places where basically staying is almost, and I'm going to exaggerate a little bit, a death sentence. That's why these people come to America. And then what they find after this, and I have a ton of books. There's one I was looking for, I couldn't find. It's called The Book of Unknown Americans. And it's the story of people from Central America mostly, coming to America to work, to survive. One of them, these are based on true stories, comes because their daughter has a terrible accident. Nobody can help her in Mexico. So they come to America for treatment. And then the father gets killed in a neighborhood that's, he should not have been in, but he gets killed for no reason at all, except that he was in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. Another one of these people in the group was invited to come to the US to work in a mushroom factory, I think in Maryland, I guess there were one of those, on the promise of a green card. And then the factory decided to cut down on the employees. Green card was gone. He had to go back. We see in that same book the case of many people who come to America with dreams and they wind up being line cooks. And I'm not even sure what that is, but I don't think that's a great job. And that's all they do. They have dreams. All they want to do is survive. But what is it like? It's not just, I'm going to come to America and get a job. We have to think of what it takes, the courage it takes, to come to a country that is not theirs, where they know they won't be accepted. It's not like, I'm just going to America and everybody's going to accept me and love me. That's not the way it works. So some of the things that I think are wonderful, I mean, I came to this country, it's a beautiful place, but we don't have a melting pot, and that's kind of nice. We have what I refer to as a kaleidoscope of cultures, and it probably should stay that way, to have all these different cultures interacting, but not disappearing. People who come to America also, as I see it, have to go through what I would call, well, we all call it that, a colander. You know, you have to go through that little thing and be kind of purged of anything that was you. And then you come and you have to get a job. You have to fit in. You have to learn language that's not yours. You may have to change or actually hide your religion, your faith. You may have to hide your political views. And you, of course, take the risk of being seen as a potential criminal. These are things that they have to face. So imagine what it's like to come to America when you come from one of these disfavored places. I call myself often as a joke, a born-again American. Because that is literally what happened to me. I came to America, I became a Christian in America, and I was born again as something new. But again, European, it's easy. But think of what it's like for all the people who come from those other countries, and what it's like for them to be reborn. They literally have to shed everything they once were. From whatever country in South America, or cultures. Which is why I think as Christian, not only do we need to think about one thing, and Dr. Carter mentioned this to us before, and I think we need to remember the difference between refugees and illegal immigrants. There's a huge difference. We need to remember what a refugee is, and we need to have open arms for them. All they want to do is survive. That's all they want to do. And as Christians, that's the duty we have, to help them survive, to provide them with a home where they will be safe, so that they can grow up and be wonderful Americans and teach us about themselves. Because their cultures are disappearing if we don't help them also. And they make us richer. I mean, again, it's a cliche, right? We're a nation of immigrants. Every nation was at one time a nation of immigrants. Yes, we're all immigrants. I'm a new one, and I'm okay here. But it's not easy for everyone. Can't we just make it easy for them? As Christians, I think that will be it for me. Thank you.
Let me start off by saying, since a large portion of the class came here for extra credit from my class, and I'm certainly are also enthralled by the subject matter, I want to let you know, if you will stay for the question and answer section, I will also exempt you from your second half of your reading response assignment. So keep that in mind. Although, by the way, if you don't read, then you are more ignorant than you might have been. So feel guilty about it. I first want to define, for my part, whenever we're considering the title of this forum, the immigration crisis, how Christians should respond, I want us to consider what we mean when we say immigration crisis. And I think you picked up most of this on context. But I believe we're referring to the influx of immigrants and refugees, primarily from the southern border, but also from other places, to the United States, particularly those fleeing poverty and violence. These travelers come to our borders as strangers, seeking a place where they can be fruitful and multiply. They just want to survive. They want their families to thrive. The crisis has been exacerbated in recent years by the inability of the United States government at local, state, and federal levels. And we must note the failure comes from both the executive and legislative branch of the federal government, who have either failed to act or circumvented the rule of law through executive orders, and through local governments who have circumvented the rule of law by forming sanctuary cities. These failures have failed to provide our nation with consistent, just, and compassionate laws legislating immigration. No, we don't have laws that are consistent or just, not just that they're one or the other. I believe that the Christian response to the immigration crisis must be oriented by the ethical expectations of the biblical narrative. The biblical narrative tells us that the human race, by our own choices, are not where we are supposed to be. By God's grace, He is restoring us back to our proper place in His presence. And in the meantime, we're expected to show compassion on those who are experiencing injustice as we wait for the final elimination of the border between God and His people. To make my case, I need you to consider the power of narrative. Narratives or stories orient the way you see the world around you. This is true both in the way that you perceive your story as an individual and the way that you perceive the story of the broader world. If you understand your story as you're a student here at Shorter as being about a Shorter student who graduates and goes on to make a lot of money and becomes ridiculously rich, then all of your decisions in the present moment are oriented by your thoughts for the story. Though, that's a poor choice of a story. Find a better and more exciting one. Dr. Garvel's already given you a vision for how business activity can be about more than building money, which is never exciting but very worthwhile. Your understanding of the story of the universe is likewise important for the way you understand the things that are happening around you. If you believe that the world comes by chance from nothing, and you are a representative of the most highly evolved species in the known universe, then your story will follow this narrative. Though again, I would encourage you to find a better story. I just graded a lot of your papers. You don't seem all that highly evolved to me. I I want to challenge you to I want to challenge you to consider a biblical story, the one that you're stuck in, if you're going to call yourself a Christian in any real sense of the word, should orient how you understand and act on the immigration crisis. The biblical story itself should shape how you view the immigration crisis, not just a series of moral precepts found in certain proof text verses in the Bible. Understanding the full force of the biblical story on this issue would take a book, but I think we can get the gist of it by looking at 3 crucial points of the biblical story. This, by the way, is about biblical cohesion. You're blessed to take Dr. Martin for systematic theology. He's going to tell you that you can't use one proof text to prove a point. The Bible as itself is a witness. First, consider the expulsion of humanity from the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3. In this story, Adam and Eve are exiled from the garden, which was a space in which God and man dwelled together. At the end of Genesis 3, the man and the woman are exiled to the east of Eden with a border guarded by a heavenly being with a flaming sword between them and the ideal space. The agricultural abundance of Eden is replaced with a desolate setting full of thorns, thistles, and cursed hard ground. This, of course, was the choice of humanity by seeking goodness outside of what God permitted. The man and woman rejected God's garden and set out to plant their own. The task is more difficult than they ever could have imagined. East of Eden, things are not as they ought to be. From this point forward, humanity has longed to enter a better place, a place like Eden, a place where we can live lives as we were intended to live, in God's presence. Eve and Adam are fruitful and multiply, but their children are born into a world of diminished goodness. The second point to consider in the biblical narrative is the Exodus event. The Exodus refers to when God miraculously rescues his people from oppression in Egypt. The story is the most dramatic narrative in the Old Testament. God takes his people who were strangers in Egypt, plagued by poverty and violence, and brings them into the Promised Land, a space which more closely resembles Eden. In this better place, so much better that it's flowing with milk and honey, they are fruitful and multiply. As the people prepare to enter the land of Canaan, God gives them a command based on their experience as oppressed strangers. Text tells us, "For Yahweh your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribe, who executes justice for the orphan and the widow, and who loves the strangers, providing them with food and clothing. You shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." It's Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 7 through 19. God's command is clear: show loving compassion to the strangers, because you were strangers yourselves. The people of God were to show compassion on the foreigners who came to their borders, because it was consistent with the way God moved their story. Finally, we come to the end. The biblical story resolves by foretelling a future setting in which the people of God, those redeemed through the death and resurrection of Jesus, end their wandering. Strangers no more, we will be at home with God. Revelation 21, verses 3 through 4, proclaims the words humanity has longed to hear since their banishment from Eden. John tells us, "And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them as their God. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eye. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away.'" Revelation 21, 3 through 4. The biblical story ends by superseding the ideal of Eden. We come into the garden city of the New Jerusalem, even better than Eden, because the victory of Jesus has eliminated the presence of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and only the tree of life remains. We are here to stay. There is no potential that we become strangers ever again. But we are not there yet. We are waiting in a country that is imperfect, and we often feel much like strangers ourselves. And I'm speaking here of us as Americans. As we wait for Jesus to finish the restoration of the world, he began at his resurrection. We need, however, to order our lives in accordance with the biblical story. A story that tells us that we are members of a race that wanders in exile in a world that is not as it should be. As a story that tells us that a defining moment of our existence occurs when God brings oppressed strangers into a good land where they could be fruitful and multiply. A story that promises an ending where we could come home at last and the burdens of our wanderings are resolved. So as we wait, we should orient our lives in expectation of the perfect end of the story. By the grace of God, which I must remind us all means unmerited favor, our country looks more like the Garden of Eden than war-torn Syria or impoverished rural Honduras ravished by the drug trade, as Dr. Carter's pointed out to us. Ours is not such a bad place to be fruitful and multiply as we wait the resolution of our story. My argument can be faulted at this point for being too idealistic. Nation states have to have boundaries and laws governing those boundaries. I'm not giving you any guidelines for making better immigration laws. But I hope I've shared with you a vision of the biblical story that helps you see whatever laws Christian supports to this end, they should be full of compassion on those who come to this nation, this place that looks more like Eden, to escape poverty and violence. Denying the oppressed the right to share in this good place is inconsistent with the force of the biblical story.
Okay, I would like to start questioning the panel. If any of you would like to chime in with a response, you're more than welcome to. My father was the only one born in this country, and his family immediately went to work in the coal mines, which are not jobs of choice in any way, shape, or form. So what these fine scholars have been talking to you about, I just want to emphasize or underline a bit of reality. You go into the coal mine and it collapses on you, and there's the end of your family. But my father did not have to deal with this terminology, and that's the first question I'd like to throw out to the panel. What do you think about language such as illegal alien? Is that a form of not only marginalization, but dehumanization? Somebody would like to speak to that? Charlie?
Yeah, I think that that's a very good question. I think whenever we use terms like illegal alien, that it serves to dehumanize children who are created in the eyes of God. We're all human beings, and we can use words selectively in order to marginalize other groups, and to say, well, this is a legal alien versus a legal alien versus illegal alien. Just the term alien itself, there's something in that that's so distinct from humanity, right? An alien is something from Mars, right? It's something from outer space. Just by using that term, I think that there's subconscious baggage that brings with you to predispose you into viewing these vulnerable refugees as an other. And so if it were up to me, if I could, use a magic wand, I would not use the term at all. I think that the term really has a negative connotation, and it certainly does it, in my view, forward the work of Christ, because whether we view these people as illegal aliens or not, he views them as his children.
What would be your preferred
Um,
term to use?
Well, that's a good question. It's one thing to say not to use something, but what would you say instead? Well, there have been all sorts of other suggestions, like undocumented worker and things like this, but you could just say person from Honduras. Very simple. I don't think you have to load it with any emotional baggage. You can say this is a person from El Salvador, a person, and so just the phrase, I think, or person would sort of at least keep it to the fore of your mind as you're dealing with humanity and not something that's totally Does that make sense?
I think I would agree. I'm sorry. Would you like to go ahead of me? You started. Sorry. I agree. And yet we live in a world that is governed by laws. And so things are either legal or illegal, and that's part of the dichotomy that we find. And so how do you define people coming legally versus those who come illegally? I don't have any problem with that. The alien part, that's just not good. It's not good. And part of the reason is if I'm a business and I want to employ someone, there's a set of laws that I have to abide by. They have to provide certain documentation before we get very far off the starting block in terms of my ability to hire. And so the legal part is good. Now, here's where I have a huge issue. Even those who come legally often have a very difficult time actually making it to citizenry. because the laws have made it such that it takes years, and in some cases, tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to become a citizen. That, in my estimation, is unconscionable. If we really are going to talk about being welcoming and open and a country free for all, there's something about $15,000 to become a citizen that doesn't sound very free, okay? So the legal, illegal part, I don't know what other words we could use. We have a very rich vocabulary, but we certainly do shrink it to fit our particular viewpoints from time to time. So I think that is a point from a business perspective. Plus the other piece to it is, since I'm older than most anybody else in this room, I'm approaching retirement age. And Social Security becomes an important factor for me. Well, did you know that the Social Security taxes you pay, Congress in their infinite wisdom, you can take it however you want, passed some sort of a law that allows my Social Security and your Social Security contributions to be used for people who are not citizens, to help them. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I don't mind the government helping. What I do mind is that's my money. I don't particularly take kindly to people taking my money and using it for purposes for which it's not designated. That's really bordering on illegal. And you can do a lot of things illegal and couch it in the name of Christ or in the name of compassion or in the name of social justice. That doesn't really change the act of what you've done. And so we need to find a vocabulary, and we need to find ways of helping those who do come here seeking that better life in a form that A, doesn't marginalize. And I wish we didn't have hyphenated Americans. I think that sets up borders immediately. And I wish we didn't. You either are or you are not, regardless of whether you were born here or you came here later. You are an American. I do find it interesting, though, that if you move to other countries, you do have to learn their language, because many of them will refuse to do business with you if you don't do it into their language. It doesn't say you have to give up your own. It just says, hey, you might have to exercise your brain a little bit and do another language. Foreign students who come here, they already know generally 3 different languages, their own, and at least 1, 2, and in some cases 3 others.
I will say, when my father got here, there was no hyphenate. He was Serbian. That's what they called him. He was not considered American, even though he was considered Serbian. So times have changed. I don't know. I'm not saying if they've changed for the better or worse yet, but I think Dr. Dusan had a comment.
Right, because one of the questions I would ask is, what is the context of using the term illegal alien? I think it's none of our business as citizens to call others illegal. If it's a legal term, that should be reserved to those in position of authority. And the term illegal itself doesn't resolve anything. When I lived in Texas, I was once told I should keep my mouth shut because I was I'll use a different word, dang foreigner. I was legal. I think I probably already had a green card if I was not already a citizen of the U.S., which I am by the way. But that was totally inappropriate. It had nothing to do with the fact that it was illegal. Illegal is a term that I hear a lot from people who are complete ignorance of the typical situation. So I don't think we, as citizens, have the right to use that term at all. I think it should be limited to those who may know and may have to act upon the term illegal, the illegality of the presence. But for us, again, we have to listen, and that's very important to me, to listen to the stories, tolerate the stories, and do what we can to help, and ignore that. They are, like many of us have said so far, first and foremost, children of God, not illegal. God put them all here with us on this planet. I don't think any of us are illegal aliens here, or even aliens for that matter. That reminds me of the Greeks, when they called everybody outside of their city state barbarians. the term has stuck. And now barbarian is somebody we don't want around. Illegal alien or even alien is pretty much the same. It's an automatic label that allows us to deny anybody the right to even exist. And that's extremely sad. We should stop using such terms. What should we use instead? Maybe first names. Hey, that's Joe, whatever his last name is. That's who they are. They are not, and Serbians, yes, I get that. But that's what they are too, right? But they are not illegal aliens. And if they are, it's none of our business. They are, first and foremost, a person with a name given by their family.
Dr. Bosworth, I'm sorry, I would like to address this really quick, because I think part of what we've stumbled on is something interesting about our vocabulary. So I'm going to have to push back a little bit about the need for the term illegal. We don't have a separate noun to describe someone who has violated immigration law. If someone steals, we don't call them an illegal shopper. We call them a thief. Okay? So we actually don't have another noun. We actually do need, not because of interpersonal dialogue. I think it would be inappropriate for me to ever look at someone who is interacting with me and say that you are an illegal alien. I'll also agree with, I think, the entire panel that alien is inherently pejorative. It's actually it's a holdover. It enters into our vocabulary predominantly through the use of the translation of the Hebrew word ger in the King James as alien. And then it sticks. It becomes more about little green men than it does about people who come from another country. But we only use it to describe illegal aliens. The reason we know it's pejorative is you probably have never heard the term legal alien, not illegal alien, because it's pejorative. But we do need the term illegal for social discourse. The rule of law is a common grace that God's given us. And so as this is a Christian approach, I think that's something that the scriptures make clear. We do need to talk about things that are done in accordance with the rule of law and not in accordance with the rule of law. Now, the laws may be bad, but we still need the vocabulary to say in social discourse that the law has been broken or has not been broken. And I'm not advocating for another noun to come up with to call someone who transgresses immigration law. But because we don't have one, illegal becomes something that's necessary. Now, the thing is that I think what we're seeing is illegal does not mean bad. Okay, illegal means that you have transgressed the laws of the land, which are in and of themselves a common grace given from God, and in this case need to be improved.
Okay, I'm going to ask the same question I was going to ask before you said that, because I think it applies maybe even more now. So, if we're talking about people, how do we not marginalize people? I don't know, I thought I saw it. There we go.
I'm Bill Hartley. I'm with Saints Bible Institute in Italy, so I'm just here for a couple of days. Thanks for letting me crash.
You're welcome.
This is interesting, and I'm from the Southwest, so I grew up in Southern California. I live in Arizona now, and I really appreciate the comments about seeing this through the biblical narrative. The biblical narrative is also that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, including us as a nation, because we have treated other nations poorly. I think of Central America, and so when we say things like, we really want to help, do humanitarian help to other nations, we've got to realize that we have really screwed up there in the past, and we don't have all the trust level in the world from other nations. But on the flip side, I have to push back against the idea that people who are wanting to come to our country just want to survive or just want to have a piece of eating. There are a lot of people on our borders who are trying to take advantage of our country and do some damage. Because I live in a state that is high crime almost exclusively because of immigration-related drug trafficking and human trafficking in the Phoenix and Tucson area. So that matters a lot to me, and I don't look over the border and just say immigration is just an opportunity for mercy, and we should be absolutely merciful even to the criminal who comes across the way. That's what God would call us to be. But when it comes to the laws of the land, this is really complicated stuff. And I don't think that we should, to call something illegal or legal, that's, like you said, that's one thing. But to peer into the soul of people, and I'll just be really quick here. I used to work on a golf course, and all the green cutters were from Mexico. They were working 2 jobs, 16 hours a day. They came up to California to work there for about 10 years, save up a bunch of money, and move back to Ensenada. They didn't want to be American. They didn't want our Eden. all they wanted was the fruit of our financial system. They just wanted money so they could go home. They were just there to use the system. So we talk about paths to citizenship and things like that. They don't want citizenship. They just want our money. And I was with someone in Ecuador, and I said, what do Ecuadorians think about Americans? Well, you know what Ecuadorians think about Americans? All they want is money. All they care about is money. And we want to go there, make money, and come home. So they just want to skim off the top. Now, is that okay? That's not it. That's really not immigration. That's just coming over to work for a while. But then what about the person who goes, the way I can really make money in America is by selling drugs in America. That's where I'm going to make a killing. And then the last little story, just so you all know this, I do my dental work in Mexico because it's a lot cheaper. You know what the minimum wage is in
Bill, just a
Mexico?
second. So you're taking advantage of their economy?
I am.
Taking advantage of their cheap.
I totally am.
So they should keep laws to keep you out, right?
They are so happy to have me that they basically build cities on the border that are all pharmaceuticals, all optical, all dental, just to have Americans come. Because a crown down there costs $200 instead of $1,200 here. So
And the people who own the American golf courses are probably paying their workers substantially less than the fair market in their area will allow to pay American workers. So we're exploiting one another's economy on the border.
I agree. And when you have that, but this is the point I was going to make, minimum wage for a worker in Mexico right now, the guy told me, and my dental assistant told me, is $4.50 a day. Now, if you're making $4.50 a day, and right across the border in Yuma, they're making $12 an hour, aren't you going to try to go take advantage of that? Of course you are. And so we've got to acknowledge that there's this longing for it, but I think it's primarily mammon and maybe not Eden. So I don't know if the soul of the immigrant is as pure and wonderful as we think it is. It's also convoluted, but I also don't think that our reception of that immigrant is necessarily pure either. So all that to say, it just smudges it all up, and it's very, very complicated, especially living down there right on the edge of the border. I wonder if you have Texas stories that are like that as well.
Right. Well, I think you made many excellent points, Bill. In fact, that's why I qualified my discussion to the term refugee for people who were trying to escape the narco states in Central America. And these narco states are very real. Honduras, Panama, El Salvador. I mean, you look at Panama from 1983 to 1989, the person who ruled Panama was, the de facto ruler was a military man named Manuel Noriega. He was running the drug trafficking in that country. We actually arrested him and put him in jail in Florida. And there have been other examples all throughout Central America. These are places, as I say, with the highest murder rate in the world. These are places where there's brutal kidnappings every day. Everyone's family has been affected, or almost everyone's family is being affected. The only way that you can really have social mobility, that is to say get access to money, is to join a cartel. In many of these places, there's an absence of law and order. So these are very, very real problems. And so the refugee crisis is very, very real. And so what is the Christian to do about it? Well, we can say, well, they're just coming over to the country for money and then want to go back home. That is actually what you call migratory labor. And so that's not, my comments are not directed at migrant labor. And we've had migrant labor in the country ever since the late 1800s. There have been waves of people from Mexico come into the country and work in fruit season and go back. So my comments is not directed at migrant labor, but rather at the very real refugee crisis. And we have potentially tens of millions of refugees in Central America and Northern South America and even the parts of Mexico. And so I would just say that one should make a distinction between migrant labor and the refugee issue. And my points are just targeted at the refugee issue, which I think are very, very real.
So, we've talked a lot about South America, Central America, Mexico. But I think one of the looming, or let's just say the big elephant in the room, is what do you do about those from Muslim countries that are trying to escape, to immigrate somewhere in terms of using your refugee sort of issue. And so, I mean, one of the things that I hope you see from this discussion is there are no easy answers. It's just hard. It's just hard, you know, but because of a group, and I'll just leave it at that, who have nefarious reasons for wanting to do certain things, many from the Muslim world have been cut off, even in Europe, and through our own president issuing an executive order, blah, blah, blah. And he's taken a lot of heat for it. I don't even want to get into him because that's really not the issue. The problem is, what do you do with somebody who, even if their faith is different from ours? Because everybody we've talked about, we think about most of Latin America, and I don't even know what terms to use anymore because they've changed a million times, and more, but let's anybody south, okay? Catholicism, big, and so that's Christian in our world. Are you with me? But that's not true in Africa. That is not true in the Middle East. Yes, there are Christians there and of varying kinds, but vast majority, obviously, is Muslim. And you can say, well, we worship the same God. No, we really do not. We have a common heritage and there is a common root. I'll let you do all of that part, but we both trace Christian lineage, if you will, back to Abraham. And so we do have a common heritage. And so if they do want to come here, how do we, and I put we, because that includes me, respond to that? They will never feel accepted, nor will we ever accept them unless we sit down and talk with them. I don't know a lot about Islam. And the few that I do know, peaceful, very peaceful. There's a couple here in Rome that helped the United States government in the Gulf War. First Baptist Church of Rome went to bat for this couple and provided safe haven for them to come to America. The U.S. government actually extracted them by helicopter, and they saw members of their family executed right before their eyes. What are you going to do? What do you do with that? And by befriending them, we understand them, they understand us. We agree to disagree on certain matters. But folks, here's something that I just cannot stress enough. I learned a long time ago. My job is not to convert anybody. Now, that's going to fly in the face of a lot of Christianese talk, okay? My job is to be a sower of the seed. God is the one who does the converting. I can't change a man's heart, but He can. My job is to sow the seed. That's what my job is. The outcome of sowing the seed is up to the Father. And if I look at it any differently, then I'm putting myself in some sort of an authoritative role to get some sort of prescribed behavior that I think is right. And that's wrong. Because you know what? I might actually be wrong about something. I know that's hard to believe, but it's true. It's true. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do missions, but you know what? Christian business people are important. Christian teachers are important. In our church, we call it engaging your domain. My domain is higher education, which in general is not known for being Christian nor conservative or any of those kinds of things. And existing in that environment, now I am blessed to be here. Don't misunderstand that. But if I were teaching at University of Georgia, I couldn't do 90% of what I do here. I could not. So if I can't, then how in the world do I propose to demonstrate Christ to them? Because I can't do it verbally in the classroom. You've got to create opportunities, and a lot of it is sitting and listening to people's stories, as Dr. Poussin talked about. Listening to their story, engaging them where they are.
Yeah, and
We have a hand